let's get that started. I'm going to blame the long weekend. It feels like it should be Monday, even though it's actually Tuesday. So I'm sorry for students who are coming in a little bit late. We've just gone through a few slides before a student reminded me that I am not recording. So now it's recording. So there you go. All right, so self-understanding and understanding of others is getting better as well. So in towards the later years of early childhood, they'll be able to get a better job at, rather than just seeing concrete things, at seeing psychological traits of other people. So saying something like, my teacher is nice, or my teacher is always stressed or frustrated or something like that, or my teacher is always happy. These are things that a child will start to be able to pick up on, partially because of experience in the world, partially be able to be that beginning of being able to put themselves in other people's shoes as well. So we're starting to see that emerge. So that's really what I just said. Motivations for multiple, or there's different motivations for the same action. So especially in social situations where they're playing with kids, or they're in school with kids, or they're in a family setting, there might be the same action from two people, but they will be able to observe and start putting this together, especially since their memory is getting better, that neurological circuitry is getting better. They're getting better at remembering, oh, this is why my sister did this versus this is why my brother did this action. My sister likes to organize her room versus my brother did it because if he didn't, he would get his toy taken away or something like that. So same behavior of organizing a room, but two different motivations there. So with this, children are getting better at feeling more and more emotions at this time. So these are things that it can be difficult to pinpoint exactly when any given emotion starts. A lot of these emotions are happening very early on. So basically at birth. So we talked about some of those, joy, anger, sadness, some of the beginning signs of empathy and even guilt we can see early on. And then as self-awareness is getting better, it leads to more complex emotions. So in the early childhood years. With that, they can have the opportunity to also control those emotions better. So disappointment, for example, that's one thing that we're working on with my youngest right now, who's in the early childhood stage. Disappointment for things like not being able to choose the show on TV when it's his sister's turn, or having to eat a specific food that is good for him, or not being able to have the candy that he wanted because it's too much candy, or only having one piece of candy versus four, something like that. So that's an example of learning and having that opportunity to control those emotions. When I did work individually with young kids, trying to get them to recognize and understand emotions, we would do specific trainings for that. We would actually sit down and talk about emotions, show pictures of faces, things like that, because we were trying to do it in a couple hour setting to help them learn and understand emotions better. Then we would do something like maybe play a game together, where during the game, maybe I would make sure to manipulate it so they won, so they could experience the emotion of happiness or achievement. Or sometimes I would also manipulate it so maybe I was cheating and they could see that I was cheating. So then they would get frustrated with me, and then we could deal with that emotion, like be able to stop and talk about the emotion in that specific setting. And that's really good when you can do that, say, as a parent or a caregiver in the moment with a child, but that's not always possible. If we're in a store setting and you're trying to, I mean, I've not really been taking my kids in the store, but as an example, you might be in a store and they want a cereal box. You say, no, you can't have that cereal box. It's not as healthy as this one, or something like that. And dealing with that disappointment there in that moment may or may not be possible depending on the schedule that you have right there. So you might be able to have a sit down conversation, or probably not sitting down, but standing up. But take the time to actually work through that emotion in the moment. But generally, this kind of process of working through emotions, learning how to regulate emotions, this should be happening throughout the days. So for working with kids, we had specific sessions where we specifically taught those emotions. Hopefully parents and other caregivers are working on these things day by day as they come up, even if you're not able to in one specific setting or intentionally making a child feel disappointment or joy or something like that. Having those opportunities is really good. So with that, also not trying to shield them from other emotions. We talked about that in infancy with sadness and joy and the inside out example. So having that opportunity to experience a bunch of emotions, but in just typical development, you're not setting up situations necessarily, although it's not necessarily a bad thing to set up a situation where they have a little more disappointment. Then you can work through that. We've done that a few times with my child to try and help them build that skill a little better. So with this, said that already. Another thing that can help is parents' expression and then also regulation of emotions. So the children are learning a lot by observation. So if they have, say, an older peer or an older sibling that is better at regulating emotions, that can be a good model. The parents can be a good model, or other caregivers can be a good model of regulating emotions and how to express emotions, how they're used in day-to-day conversations. Because I'm using disappointment as an example a couple times, probably because it's one that we're working on in this house. But that's something that happens. If you're with a group of friends, most of your friends want to do thing A and you want to do thing B, you might be disappointed. And so a child learning and experiencing that, learning how disappointment works within a group, maybe the group decides, oh, well, we don't want you to feel disappointed. It doesn't matter to us that much. Maybe we'll go do group thing B. So emotions are an important part of our social interaction. So children are learning how they work within social interactions. They're also learning the words that we ascribe to emotions, what motivates their feelings. So something gets taken from them, they might get angry, they win a game, they feel happy, they can't quite stretch out enough on the twister board to get their hands on the opposing colors, they might feel disappointed. That one happened yesterday. So with this, they do a better job at reflecting on their emotions. This is why in the work I did with children, we were able to sit down with children in early childhood and actually talk about emotions, show faces, read books, picking books that have socio-emotional components to them, about emotions or as part of the story is also a really good thing for helping develop this in children. I said a lot of these things just in my talking about this rather than reading through the slides, so that's why I'm just skipping through. I'm just looking for any points that I didn't hit in on as I was talking about it. So emotion coaching parents versus emotion dismissing parents. So we've talked a little bit about how, like, directly in training for children, I sat them down and talked about emotions, things like that. So that is very similar to what emotion coaching parents do. Rather than having a specific time that they will do this, as they arise, an emotion coaching parent will be able to be aware enough and responsive enough to monitor their child's emotions, to see what the child is feeling, be able to even predict that, hey, it looks like this is about to happen. I predict that my child's going to feel this emotion. With that, they also view negative emotions. This is a really critical piece between the emotion coaching and emotion dismissing parent. The emotion coaching parent will view those negative emotions as a teaching opportunity, a time to learn how to work through that emotion, to solve the problem, those kinds of things. So with that, an emotion coaching parent will help a child label their emotions. So as an example, sometimes if my child's getting upset, I'll say, hey, Malcolm, how are you feeling right now? Or let's take a breath and we'll talk about our feelings, something like that. And then coaching on how to deal with those emotions. So if it's a negative emotion like disappointment or anger, solving the problem can be a good way, or calming down and then doing something else. So different ways to regulate that a child is capable of. Using scaffolding, so teaching to their level, and then also praising them when they're doing a good job, when they're following directions, where they're paying attention to the emotion coaching, when they try it out themselves, even if they just take one breath. Like you can see them getting frustrated, they take a breath and then they yell or hit or something. You can praise them for the good things that they did there, for taking a moment or something like that. So, and then obviously modeling good emotion regulation. So that's emotion coaching parents. You might, oh, we haven't actually talked about parenting styles yet. That's later in the slide. So never mind. I'll make those connections later. So an emotion dismissing parent, the big difference here is ignoring or denying or kind of trying to suppress or dismiss negative emotions most often. So with this, they tend to be poorer models of emotion regulation, like not regulating their own emotions, rejecting emotions children have. So a statement someone who's emotion dismissing might say is stop crying, versus an emotion coaching parent might say something like, let's take a breath and then we can solve the. So that is, now we'll jump into moral development in early childhood. This is one of the topics that's most interesting to me. So I'm definitely going beyond what the book talks about. The book talks a little bit about Kohlberg and a little bit about moral development. There's a lot more research beyond that for most of these topics. And so this is one area that I'm going to give you a little more information, and then the next couple topics, same kind of thing. Especially in early childhood. So we talked about empathy a few weeks ago, and how empathy is there, or the beginnings of empathy are there right at birth. A child can share the emotions of another child. This gets better and more improved as children get into early childhood. It's not until near the end of early childhood that they really get the capacity to start taking the perspective of other people. And it might not even be for some children into middle childhood that they have that capacity to take the perspective of someone else. So for empathy, you need those two pieces. You need the feeling what others are feeling and cognitively taking their perspective. So that cognitively taking their perspective might not be there at the beginning of early childhood, and for some it might not be there at the end of early childhood, but they're getting better. They're working on this. So what is moral development? Well, here's one definition that I think is pretty all-encompassing, so maybe a little general, but it's the development of thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and I'd say habits as well, regarding the rules and conventions generally that a society has about what people should do in interactions with others. So you can think of the rules and conventions in cultures across the United States about what people should do in their interactions or relationships with other people. So that's moral development, developing those thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and habits that are centered around how we're supposed to be, how we should be, how we're being taught to act with other people. So with this, guilt is a prototypical moral emotion, one of the first that was researched and one of the first that appears in children. It is a moral emotion because it drives us to fix whatever thing we've done to make us feel guilty. So we might do something pro-social, do something for another person because maybe we hurt them. Maybe a child stole a toy and sees the other child cry. So that might motivate them, and they might feel a little guilty. It might motivate them to give that toy back or play a different game, try to help the child feel a little bit better. Also, empathy. So I think this one, unless something happened that they caused this child some pain, this one probably looks like empathy to me. But I mean, that's just a picture. It's hard to tell. So empathy, you're feeling a feeling of another person. So you see someone feeling sad, you also feel sad yourself. And then if you can take their perspective, it makes it a lot better to be able to understand, well, why are they feeling sad? But even in early childhood, you might see them try to cheer a child up. Even if they don't really understand why they're feeling sad, they might have that empathy and try to do something pro-social for them. So that kind of pro-social behavior, depending on the researcher that you're looking at, pro-social behavior and moral behavior are sometimes used synonymously. I usually don't use them synonymously, but at this level, I think it's fine to use them synonymously. So with that, again, children at this age are still struggling with taking someone else's perspective. So with this, moral reasoning is also a piece of moral development. So your own reasoning and cognitive processes about in any given situation of a relationship between people. How should you be acting? How should you behave? What should be happening? Those are the things that you're developing over time. And part of that is how you then think about and ration or use rationale to decide what is my action going to be right now. So am I going to go and help this child? That kind of thing. Think again, this is early children. So an early child thinking, hey, am I going to go and help this child who is having a hard time, show them some empathy. But at this time, one thing Kohlberg thought is that here, in between the ages of about 4 and 7, that children seem to observe justice and rules as really unchangeable properties outside of personal control. That the rules exist, that they're there, that they're like written in stone, you might say, that's what the rules are. The consequences are really important for understanding, especially from Kohlberg's perspective. The consequence will help teach a child. So seeing someone maybe steal something from another kid and then get a consequence for that, that will help a child see, well, that's the rule. This is how you should behave in this given situation. Also, this you might see in this age of child, if they do something that might be typically considered bad, like say breaking a dish, they might think that they're a bad kid. So let's say it's a complete accident. They're eating their food and all of a sudden the dish flies off the table, not like they were intentionally throwing it, but it just gets bumped and knocked down and breaks. They might feel really bad or say sorry. I see this with my youngest sometimes, doing something on accident that makes something fall in the house or something like that. Then being a little worried, saying, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Well, helping him understand, hey, you're not a bad kid. It's part of that development, that understanding that there's the intention behind something is important. Just last night, the kids were playing on their bed upstairs, and they ended up crumpling a poster that my daughter was going to take to school, like for a little presentation. And so they were just playing. It wasn't intentionally like trying to crush the poster, but they thought that they were going to get in trouble, that they were bad, and so they were nervous about what consequences might happen because of that. Then in middle childhood, Kohlberg talked about transitioning towards understanding a little bit better that these rules are more like guidelines or standards, that they're not written in stone as much. So, and then age 10 and beyond, they understand that these rules were created by people, that they can be changed, they can be altered. Some might not be useful as well. And they're, at this time, they should be capable of understanding the intentions behind behaviors. And that's important for what you should or should not do in a given situation. So with this, these changes come through experience. So experience a thing like knocking over a lamp in the house on accident versus intentionally breaking a lamp because you're angry or something like that. Experiencing those and seeing how people around you behave will teach a child how they should act in any given situation. Will start to help them know that that intention behind it is important as well. So you can do the same thing as well with this as with socio-emotional development and learning to manage emotions. You can sit down and have conversations, read a book, or watch a movie specifically about some kind of situation where there's, say, a moral dilemma or something. But normally this is, or on average, this is just happening in day-by-day interaction within a context. So modeling, positive reinforcement, specific discussion about behaviors and the motivations behind behaviors, parent talking through their decision-making processes, those things can be really helpful. And then getting positive reinforcements when they choose to do something pro-social can be really helpful for children as well. So let's watch this little video. I'm trying to cram a lot into a very short time, and so this video also tries to cram a lot into a very short time. This is a video of Marvin Berkowitz talking about moral development. And so Marvin Berkowitz works in a lot of applied settings for moral development of children. So there's a lot of socio-emotional learning that might go on in school. Part of that might be moral development, so helping to teach children specifically how they should behave in a given society based on the rules and of that culture. So Berkowitz talks about a couple of the different points that they found in research over time in a really short snippet, but any of those points that it talks about, there's books and papers and whole bodies of research around that area, which is an area that I'm pretty well versed in. So if it's of interest to you and you hear mention something or I've mentioned something, feel free to ask me and I can maybe send you some resources for a question paper, or if any of these are interesting to you, you can go off on your own searching Google Scholar or PsycInfo for additional information as well. Let's watch this really quick.
The 5 things are, and they're more complicated than this, so please understand that I'm giving you the shortened version, but there's some stuff we got written on this if you want to be glad to connect you to all that. First one is an obvious one, love and support. Kids need love and support from parents. Second one is that parents need to set high expectations, but there are caveats with that. They need to be scaffolded and supported and so on. They can't be unreasonable, but we do need to set high expectations for academics, for behavior, and so on down the line. The fourth one is that, third one, sorry, is you need to model it. You need to practice what you preach. You have to be the character, goodness, you want to see in your kids. You can't ask them to do it, not be it yourself, and the same thing for teachers.
So this is actually a point that becomes really, really important in adolescence, and we'll probably talk about it there, but it's in my mind, so I'll talk about it now. We talked about the self-understanding, and then later on, closer to adolescence, in developing an identity, you test out different identities. You look at your own behavior as an adolescent and see, hey, was this action, was this behavior consistent with who I see myself as? So they also, around adolescence, will be comparing parents' behavior and caregivers and teachers and other authority figures with the things that authority figure says. So if a parent is saying, hey, do these things, but the parent doesn't act that way, it can cause a lot of tension there in adolescence, especially because of seeing that kind of, really hypocrisy. And there's still some black and white thinking there in early adolescence. So that can lead to a lot of tension between that authority figure and the adolescent. And this is happening at the same time. They're looking at that in themselves. They're looking for consistent aspects of themselves over time. So they're really attuned to that as well. So important to start that early for a child, or be consistent through life in that way. Change is obviously possible, important, and good, but I'm not saying to do one thing and then doing the opposite thing. Let's get back to early childhood.
You have to talk, the fourth one is talk to kids about how their behavior affects other people. It's really important. You have to have those conversations where you let kids know how their behavior helps somebody, hurts somebody, upsets somebody, enlightens somebody, whatever. How does their behavior affect others' particular feelings? And the last one is you have to encourage and empower kids' voices. Kids' voices are stifled too much in this world. They're disempowered. They're an oppressed class, if you will. One thing you've heard of already, Mark talked about, was this top 10. We asked adolescents a whole list of questions about, do your parents do this and how often do they do it? And we found there were 10 things that stood out for us, and they're in your packet, that the parents of giving teams do more than the parents of other teams do. So these are things you see as a difference between them. And I won't go through the whole list with you. There are 3 that I like to focus on just because I'm a number guy. And the numbers that these are probably the biggest differences, but they're all important ones. One is that parents explain how I can help other people by my actions. So my parents talk to me about how my actions can help others. That was one. The second one is my parents encourage me to speak up in family discussions. And the third one, these are the top 3. My parents talk to me about the volunteering and charity they do. They let me in on their stuff. There are more, I can't go through all of them with you.
So Berkowitz is a good one to look for. He's got things that are written at a very scientific level with the stats and the numbers, but also things written for policymakers. So like very short bullet points, like do this X, Y, Z kind of thing, and everything in between, things written for parents as well. It's got a pretty big body of work. So could be a useful source if it's of interest to you to doing a question paper. So a lot of these things, and we might generally think of, I know for my own parents, these kinds of discussions related to moral development usually were like sit down every once in a while, like have a discussion about how life is going. What tends to be the most effective is just as they happen in life. So as my child steals something from the younger child, talking about, well, how did that make you feel? Talking about their emotions in that minute, talking to the child who stole something about how do you think your actions affected that? And then just yesterday, my older child was reading books to my younger child a couple times when the younger child asked. And so sitting down, or like just in the day, we didn't have like a sit down conversation where we intended and planned to like talk about this, but we said, hey, I'm really happy that you read books to your brother when he was asking for it. That made him really happy. And so just that little interaction, those kinds of little things day by day are the things that help a child understand and process and think about their reasoning. Well, why did I do that? That kind of thing. It doesn't have to be a once a week or a once a day or a once a month or a twice a year thing where you sit down and have this kind of in-depth conversation. It's these little things that happen all the time, essentially, with emotion regulation, with moral development, moral reasoning, those kinds of things. So it seems like a lot of things to focus on as a parent or a caregiver, and it can be. But being observant to things like the emotions, the actions, and responsive will help you to do those things. If you need to practice, like as a parent or a caregiver, if you want to practice specifically focusing on moral behaviors, you could do that for a little while. That might start to become a habit for you. So that can be good too for children. All right, so gender identity. This is one thing that your book touches on, but we're going to go in a little bit more depth on as well. So with this, the sense of being male, gender identity, definition of it is that sense of being male, female, agender, gender fluid, gender queer, transgender, or any other genders that exist. So that is gender identity. So most children do acquire a gender identity by about age 3. So very early on in early childhood, or even at the later end of what we consider infancy. So they have that, but at this point in time, they might not even have the words to describe their own identity. So it is a challenge to work with children in their gender identity, because they might not yet have the words to talk about it. It's still not something that's a variety of gender identities are probably not what a child is exposed to in the media, in the books and stories that they're reading and shows they're watching and the people they're meeting. So it can be difficult for a child to understand and describe who they are. With that, oh, well, there we go. So it might be hard for them to describe themselves as anything other than male and female at this time, because they're still, one, learning language, having more experiences, seeing other people in the world, and maybe or maybe not understanding that there are other options outside that binary. So this is a really good video that shows, I think it's a kindergarten teacher, speaking about a child who whose gender identity wasn't clear until a little bit later on, and how their own interactions with the child might have fostered that same male-female binary. So I think it's a really good one. We'll only watch the first 4 minutes, but it is longer. If you're interested, feel free to watch it on your own time. But the main point of it is the story, and then it goes into research in gender identity in early childhood, but in more depth than we're going to go into here, actually. So if it is of interest to you, go for it. Sorry, that was loud.
have been a teacher for 15 years. 12 years ago, I had a student in my class whose name was Michael. We called him Mikey for short. By every indicator I had available to me, Mikey was a boy. Big green eyes, short curly hair, a sweet shy voice. He was adorable. He was also really smart, and he loved to draw. Sadly, Mikey had a hard time making friends and would often come to me at recess in tears. Socially, nothing seemed to go his way. Now, fast forward 10 years. I was getting into my car after school one day, and I heard someone call my name. I looked up, and I saw this spunky young woman, tank top, short skirt, combat boots. She looked familiar, but I couldn't quite place her. "I'm Mikey," she said. "Well, you knew me as Mikey, but now my name is Mandy." My world shifted. I was shocked. Instantly, though, I recognized those green eyes from kindergarten, and I reached out and hugged her. At that point, Mandy was a junior in high school and had, within the last few months, decided to live her life as a girl. But let me be clear, she didn't decide she was a girl. That she'd known for a long time. What she decided was to be and live in the world as her true self. Well, I asked Mandy why she hadn't thought of an easier moment to make the change, like going to college. She looked at me and said, "Batya, I could not wait one more day." When she recalled her years at elementary school, she remembered how much she hated going to the bathroom, the boys' bathroom. How every time teachers would put students in boys' lines and girls' lines, she hated it. I cringed when I thought how my boy-girl language reinforced a system where Mandy couldn't find a place for herself. Well, her story threw me for a loop. As a teacher, one of the most important things to me is that every child in my class feels safe. Well, determined to not make the same mistake again, I decided to get curious. I began to observe how gender was playing out in my classroom, and I did some research. And this is what I found. There are many myths and assumptions out there about gender, and they don't only hurt kids like Mandy, they hurt us all. So tonight, I want to look at two main ones. The first myth is that gender is binary. What that means is we have two choices. We can either be masculine and male and feminine and female, nothing in between and nothing beyond. The second myth is that a person's sex and gender are the same thing, when in fact, they're quite different. Sex is our biology. It's our anatomy. It's that moment at birth when someone lifts us up, looks between our legs, and declares, "It's a boy, it's a girl." That is our assigned sex at birth. Now, here's something really interesting that I found out. 1 in 2,000 babies are born with genitals that don't conform to the gender boxes. That's more than 2 babies a day. Just that fact alone for me blew open the gender binary myth.
Right, so definitely goes into a lot more research here. So if it's of interest to you, we're going to touch on a couple of the points, but not all of the depth that they go into right there. But I think that story is really, I hope it's clear, seeing that, especially in early childhood, you're still developing language, or you have this start of your sense of self, of who you are. You have specific models that you've looked at and been able to be exposed to, certain books or TV shows that you've seen stories of. So it can be difficult as for any child to see themselves as anything other than just that male-female binary. So my main point here is hopefully what we can do as a society is change things so that it is more clear, so that our language is more inclusive. I know this is something that I still struggle with. So our research is better. I've mentioned a couple times that it's not always clear whether something is a sex or gender difference in the research, because some of the researchers still have this thing of having sex and gender being the same thing. So you have a demographic sheet, you don't have a separate question for sex versus gender or something like that, even if it's important. And then do the people answering it, do they know that distinction? So it's definitely something that is changing, and definitely needs to continue as well. So one aspect of that is the gender roles that a child is exposed to. So these are the sets of expectations that we prescribe to how any given gender should act, think, and feel. So these are an older ad and then a newer take on that ad here, which I think is funny. I just tried over Valentine's Day to do some home brewing of beer, and we didn't burn it, so that was good. We'll see how it comes out in a couple weeks when that fermentation process is done. With this, children follow these roles more and more over preschool years. So as they're observing this, as they see gender roles playing out in people around them, they start to follow along with those, because this is the societal rules. This is, you could say, any gender role could be seen as a tool of a culture. So if we think of Vygotsky's sociocultural learning theory, a child is learning these gender roles and then it's being scaffolded to them. Maybe not intentionally, but this is a thing that they are learning and then following. So biology, genetics, hormones, and chromosomes all influence this process of gender identity, as well as gender roles and social cognitive factors, people that they're exposed to, the reinforcements or punishments that they might get. So this goes into the social cognitive theory of gender. So states that gender development occurs through observation and imitation. So seeing other people's gender roles, seeing how people act, and the reward or punishment of gender appropriate or inappropriate behaviors. So you might have seen this yourself in earlier childhood. You might have seen on TV or from peers the culture around gender and what gender roles should be. As an example, so, well, gender schema is another topic, is another definitional word here. A schema is essentially a cognitive structure, how we understand a certain topic. So you have your schema of gender, your own understanding of gender, that's your gender schema. It's that network of associations neurologically that guide your perception. So as you see things, it goes through that schema, it goes through that filter of understanding. So we have schemas of a lot of things. We have a schema of like what a dog is. For example, an ostrich, like if I said, hey, what's a bird? Or draw me a bird, you probably have a schema of a bird, like your own idea of what a bird is cognitively. So you probably wouldn't draw an ostrich or a penguin because it's probably a little off from your gender schema. Or if I said, hey, draw a mammal, you might not draw a whale, even though a whale is also a mammal, just because it's maybe a little off of your schema for that thing. All right, so with that, they're developing these schemas through this learned experience, through day-to-day interactions, through things that they're seeing in books and media. So if you ever hear about, well, there should be more representation, this is one reason why that's important, because it allows them to see those other possibilities. And so this overlaps a lot with that social cognitive theory. And peer influence gets more and more important through middle childhood and into adolescence. So parents' influence still here in early childhood is some of the most important. So with that, childhood teasing, though, say there's a boy playing with a doll and gets teased about that. Maybe that's not gender conforming behavior. That might make that child less likely to play with that doll. They're learning in that what the gender role or how they should behave in that kind of situation. Or a girl who gets called a tomboy because they like climbing trees or doing parkour or something like that. These are things that just in day-to-day life are teaching a child what their role is in that society. So with this, gender nonconforming boys are more at risk of peer rejection. Gender nonconforming girls are are not necessarily not at risk of rejection, just the probability of rejection or the risk factor is higher for gender nonconforming boys than it is for gender nonconforming girls. All right, so with this, at age 3, a lot of groups are same gender, and it stays pretty consistent until adolescence, where there's more mixed gender friend groups. There's more gender exclusivity when you get to later early childhood, so 4 or 5 or then 6. So early on, there's a mix of genders within peer groups. Then they become more like separated off into gendered groups, and then in adolescence, there's more of a mixing, basically around the time puberty, dating, those kinds of things. So with this, boys tend to be a little more likely to play sports, do rough and tumble play, conflict, versus girls tend to be more likely to engage in collaborative discourse, reciprocal conversation, and have play around those kinds of topics in early childhood. So, and these are also roles that are being learned at the same time. All right, so we've said a lot about gender development at this time. Before we move on to family and early childhood, are there questions about this? So hit a couple topics that might be new things to you and definitely went beyond what the book is talking about here as well. All right, well, maybe what we should do, if anyone does have questions or input on this, I mean, feel free at any time. At any time I'm talking, raise your hand or put a comment up. Hopefully I see the comment a little quicker than I saw the recording comment a minute ago. Yeah, definitely feel free to interrupt and raise your hand or put something in the chat box. If I think we'll take a quick break till about 9:20. Or sorry, 9:25, because it's basically 9:20 right now. So we'll take a quick break till 9:25. If you do want to have any comments or anything like that or questions, feel free to put them in the meeting chat in the meantime. But let's take a quick break and be back at 9:25. Great. All right, and we are back. Hopefully the audio is still good. All right, let's move on to family and early childhood. We're going to talk about parenting styles. I hope we have time to do our activity with parenting styles, but it might have to be the beginning of class next time. But I think we'll be able to get through it right now. It's kind of a fun one. All right, so in studies of parents, so parents are more satisfied with their lives overall than non-parents for adults. So what that means is things like eudaimonic well-being, they rate higher. On things like purpose in life, they rate higher. They on surveys that say, hey, how satisfied are you with your life? Parents tend to rate themselves a little higher, but they also tend to have more variable hedonic well-being. So at its core, eudaimonic well-being is more like your overarching, do you have a good sense or do you feel good about who you are in life? Do you have goals that are important to you? Are you working towards those goals? Versus hedonic well-being is more like the more immediate. Are you happy today? Like, do you feel good today? Kind of thing. So for the things, are you happy today? Parents tend to rate those a little more variable than non-parent adults. So probably because sometimes kids make things go a little crazy or stressful. So some days might not be great. Some individual days might not be super great for that hedonic well-being, but the eudaimonic well-being tends to be a little higher. So you can think of like short-term interactions might not be as positive, or like those short instances of emotions might be more variable for parents in their responding, but the overall satisfaction with life or feeling a sense of well-being tends to be rated higher for parents. All right, with this, they also have more positive feelings about caring for children than other daily activities. So as an example, I've got to do the dishes in a little while. So like put the dishes that were in the dishwasher away so that daily activity or that daily task, we're like driving to pick up groceries or something like that, that daily task versus the daily task of like getting the child off to school. I have more positive feelings about caring for the child and getting them off to school than I do about doing the dishes, as a concrete example there. Who likes doing the dishes? Hopefully some people, because that's a job a lot of people have. So parenting quality tends to be the most important, not just the quantity of time, but the quality, how responsive that parent is. So hopefully you've seen that already when we've talked about infancy and temperament and responding to a child. The quality of that responding is really important to their development. So parents, especially in infancy and early childhood, are almost the primary source of what the child is taking in and how they're developing over time. As we get into adolescence, peers in some ways become more important for some things. So like the way your parent views you and their opinion of you in adolescence versus the way a peer views you or your peers view you, and like peer pressure, those kinds of things. Some aspects of that, peers become more important in adolescence, but right now it's still very much parent focused. So let's talk about a couple different parenting styles. So these are, I think, as you'll see some of the examples that don't quite fit within these 4 boxes, I think you'll see that these boxes in and of themselves are a little bit reductionist, but they're a good starting point to understanding parenting styles. So we'll start with authoritarian parenting, and you can actually see this diagram here. So here we've got higher responsiveness and warmth, and here we've got higher demandingness and control. So they're all on those dimensions: responsiveness and warmth, or responding, and then control or demandingness. So those are the dimensions we're looking at for each of these types of parenting. So authoritarian parenting, we mentioned this a couple times ago, but now we're going into a little more detail. So authoritarian parents tend to be more restrictive. So they're high in demandingness over here. They set firm limits and control. There's very little to maybe even no exchange between a child and a parent about the rules, about curfew times. Let's take an adolescent example of curfew times. In early childhood, even with an authoritative parent, there might not be a ton of back and forth, but for an authoritative parent, there's very little exchange and discussion between a child and that parent. So it's my way or the highway. You'll do it my way or else. Might be something that you would hear from an authoritarian parent. So when you think of authoritarian parent, because authoritarian and authoritative, they've got some of the same root words. So even I sometimes mix them up. As I'm talking about them, I might say authoritative when I mean authoritarian and vice versa. So I'm sorry if I do that. I try really hard not to mess that up because that can be really confusing. But to help you think of other connections between these words, so you might think of an authoritarian parenting, like an authoritarian regime within a household or something like that. So with this, children do tend to be more unhappy, fearful, or anxious. They tend to have more externalizing problems, which are things that are like observable to outside parties. So aggressive behaviors, acting out, things that you might get in trouble for in school. Internalizing problems would be things like the anxieties. That's something that you might not see as an outside observer, but a person might be experiencing. So externalizing problems are like doing vandalism. That might be seen as an externalizing problem, something someone from the outside might be able to see. So authoritative parenting. So now we've moved here from authoritarian. So it's low on that warmth. It's high on demandingness. Here we're moving to authoritative, which is still high on demandingness, but it's also high on warmth and responsiveness. So these kinds of parents will encourage independence, but they still have set limits and controls. So there's specific rules or boundaries to be within, or certain limits, like you cannot do XYZ. You can't pull a cat's tail, for example. That's a limit at our house. Sorry, my brain went off on a whole other tangent, and I'm like, that's really not relevant to this class. I'm not going there. So there's limits and controls for an authoritative parent, but there are extensive discussions with the child. So extensive discussions on why is it a rule not to pull the cat's tail? I swear that's a discussion every single day in this house. Why do we not pull cats' tails? So there's extensive discussions here. There's still a lot of support and warmth for the child. There's a lot of quick responding to a child's needs and constructive responses. So if a child is asking, why do I have to do this? There's a back and forth. There's an actual discussion of, well, this is why, versus for an authoritative parent versus an authoritarian parent, there would be something like a child would say, why do I have to do this? And the parent would say something like, because I said so. That might be something you'd see distinguishing authoritative versus authoritarian. So there won't necessarily be those extensive discussions with an authoritarian parent versus an authoritative parent is going to be quick to respond, care about maybe caring about is not the right word, but they will take the time. They'll be more likely to have that kind of back and forth with a child versus an authoritarian parent. So with this is often seen as the best parenting style or the most positive, because for most groups, we do see the most positive outcomes. So it's a protective factor for a lot of things versus authoritarian parenting is a risk factor for some things. So children of authoritative parents tend to be more cheerful, more self-reliant, have more self-control. You can imagine if there's situations where there's rules and settings, but they're talking about those rules, it allows the child the opportunity to maybe be upset about those rules, but having a back and forth helps them develop that emotion regulation. So less stress, more pro-social behavior, and then more cooperative from authoritative parents. So for most groups, this tends to have the most positive outcomes, but it's not true for all groups, and not every kind of parent or not every individual parent fits neatly into each of these boxes. But so just as a kind of tease before we talk about that. So this one over here, we've got uninvolved parenting. So neglectful or uninvolved. Usually I call this neglectful. So this one is both low in control, strictness, or demandingness, but also very low in warmth. So the parent is, in this case, is very uninvolved in the child's life. They're not giving the child very much warmth, but they're also not giving the child very many restrictions or rules or structure at all. So they don't interact with the child very much. So here, children of uninvolved parents tend to be more socially incompetent, especially in early childhood, because most of the interactions, social interactions that the child is developing and observing through are from parents and primary caregivers. So they're not going to be as competent socially because they're not having as many opportunities to have that kind of social interaction because there's a completely uninvolved primary caregiver there. Poorer self-control, low self-esteem, more immature, they might be rated as more immature. They might have higher truancy, higher delinquency, especially as they're getting into middle and childhood and adolescence. So this is a parent who might even be present in the home, but is just not involved in the child's life. They're neglectful. Versus permissive is up here. They're very high in warmth and responsiveness, but very low in control or strictness or demandingness. So they don't have a lot of demands that they're placing on the child, but they have very, very high warmth to the child. So they're usually very highly involved, very few demands. You might say they're letting a child do whatever they want. So they're, I think we heard an example, I don't remember if it was this class or another class, of one of the students' friends was a babysitter of a child who seemed like their parents were very permissive. The parents were not setting demands or controls on them. They were giving them warmth because the child was adopted. They were just trying to be really warm and positive and loving, which in and of itself is a good thing, right? But not having those kinds of demands and controls can lead to some of these behaviors were what the babysitter had seen. So children these parents have a harder time learning to respect others, have harder time controlling their behavior. They might be domineering, egocentric, and have poor peer relations with others. So you can see that there are some risk factors involved with these three parenting styles and some protective factors involved with this parenting style. So like I said, though, while we generally consider authoritative the best, it doesn't actually fit in everyone. I already answered this question for you. Yep, I thought it was this group. Thank you, Daniela. Is there anything else you would like to add about these parenting styles or any examples or anything like that? I thought that one that you shared previously was really useful. But if there's any examples or any kind of situation anybody's like, does this fit authoritative or authoritarian? This would be a good time to ask.
Well, I have another example. My cousin, she had twins and she had an older boy, and she would just let them do like whatever they want and she wouldn't care. Sometimes you go to her house and the kids are like dirty and playing in the carpet, like watching TV, and we tell her like, you're not doing anything with them, like they should have a shower or something. And she's like, the carpet's like taking care of them right now. They don't need a babysitter. Like, I don't need to be watching over them. Like, she would just do like her thing, like she was single, like nothing to worry about. And the kids would just stay there. Like, so my aunt would be there like all the time because she'll make like food for the kids. She'll make them take a shower. She'll give them attention because she just wouldn't care at all.
Yeah, thank you for that example. That sounds like a pretty clear example of uninvolved or neglectful parenting there. So it's good that there was another family members that were aware and could come in and be some of those authoritative. So setting those kinds of limits or demands, like taking baths or showers, because that's good for the health of a person's body, right? Or brushing teeth, those kinds of things. So yeah, that's a really clear example, I think, of neglectful parenting. So thank you for sharing that. All right, if there's any questions on how do different styles between two parents impact the kids? So is authoritarian as risky if matched with an authoritative parent? That's a really good question. So if there's two parents of a child, so a child has two parents, one is authoritative, one is authoritarian. there's a bunch of things that might happen. So one thing that it's not early childhood, it's more adulthood, and co-parenting. It might make it more difficult to co-parent with that parent when they're using a different style. But if you can co-parent effectively so that you're still coming to decisions together, they're still probably going to be getting a good mix of those high demands from both, but also getting warmth, at least from one of those parents. So it should be a protective factor, so it shouldn't be as risky as having two authoritarian parents. So having one authoritarian and one authoritative, that authoritative parenting, that warmth and responsiveness is going to be protective against some of the risk factors of that authoritarian parent. So that's a really good question, but it also might make it hard for those parents to interact and co-parent well. But that's kind of a different topic than what will it do for the kids. And with that, it can make it more difficult for the child. So for example, the child might, if you were going for like a permissive versus authoritarian parent, that would be a really hard relationship for those parents to do. So permissive and authoritarian are just so vastly different, that you'd probably have a child only going to one of those parents because they feel like their needs are met by one of those parents, versus if you have authoritative and authoritarian, they're probably still able to develop strong attachments with both of those since there's enough similarities. But if you've got one parent over here and over here, you're probably going to gravitate, that child's probably going to gravitate to one of them, versus a parent here and the other parent over here, the child will probably gravitate to one of those. All right, so there's more questions. I saw first the question, can you change between parenting styles? And then I saw Daniela's hand go up. So let's answer the question about, can you change between parenting styles? Yes. These are a lot of our parenting habits that we have tend to be learned behavior and schemas that we developed even as children as we were being parented. So if both your parents were authoritarian, you will tend to be a little more authoritarian. Now, can you change that? Can you learn new parenting skills? Yes, but it generally does take specific effort to change parenting styles. It can definitely change, but usually it takes the person's own effort. Like there's times when I realize, oh, I'm being too authoritarian, and I have to consciously think about being more authoritative. I could say take a parenting course specifically to help me with that, for example. So, but yes, it can change, but it often on its own, it doesn't naturally tend to change, but it is something that's capable of being changed. Having a partner who is more authoritative versus one that is authoritarian, there will probably be some change for both of them, whether it's the authoritarian becomes authoritative or the authoritative parent becomes authoritarian. Probably it's going to be a little bit, both of them come a little closer to each other if they're co-parenting well. So that would be a situation where just kind of natural, not intentionally trying to change parenting styles, they will change. But yes, with intention, you can definitely change parenting styles for sure. So good question. So I think next I saw Daniela's hand go up. So go for it, Daniela.
Sorry, it's me again. So I was going to say something about the other question, when you have like two different parent style. I grew up with my mom being authoritative and my dad being authoritarian. And it was like kind of hard. Like, I remember like when I was like early, like on my early, like 5 years old or like 4 or 5 years old. And my dad was in a very stressful job, and he would come home very stressed. And if there's something that he didn't like, he would be like yelling at us, throwing plates. If there's like dishes to do, like, so we'd be like super afraid of him. But he'll never do that in front of my mother. If my mother was home, he'll never do that. And so like, and we had to do like everything as he said, like, and my mom was very warm, and she would explain to us like things how it has to be done. So we became way more close to my mom than my dad. And then my dad like changed jobs and got like a less stressful job, and then he changed. But then I couldn't get as close to him as I was with my mom. Like even like now that years has passed by, I come home, like I hug my mom, I kiss my mom, and with him I just like say hi. And he sometimes complains like, hi, why nobody like come and kiss me or hug me? Like my younger brother is better on that with him, but like I'm still having like a hard time with it. So like I can see like the different styles, like how it can be on the children, if like after they grow up, like it's different how you see the parents.
Thank you very much for sharing that. I appreciate anybody sharing their own experience as well as experiences that they've heard about from peers or cousins, things like that. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. It's really illustrative of a lot of the points we've been talking about here, and then a couple of the points that we're going to be talking about a little bit later. So definitely thank you for that. Really clear examples there of authoritarian. And then that also gets into punishment styles as well, I think, that we'll talk about next time in class. So hopefully we can remember this specific example as we're reading some of the next comments or some of the next slides next time. So before the end of class, though, it doesn't look like we'll have time to do our activity, which is totally fine. We'll do a quick review of the parenting styles at the beginning next time, and then basically we'll watch some short videos and you will decide in a group which parenting style you see. So do children tend to adapt parenting styles of their parents that they grew up with? Sorry, let me reread this. Okay, yeah. So do children adopt the same parenting style that they were parented with? That tends to be the most common outcome, yes. So if both parents were authoritative, that child will then, if they become a parent, will probably be authoritative. If the parents were both authoritarian, the child will tend to be authoritarian. It's not 100% of the time. I don't remember offhand even what the percentage is. It's above 75%, just on average, have the same parenting style as their parents, and this is because of that observation. So seeing authoritative parenting versus authoritarian parenting, that gives the opportunity as well to be able to see and pick and choose which things that they would do with their own children later on. Also, the examples of authoritative versus authoritarian parenting, there's so many things to talk about that are relevant to that example, but we haven't got to those slides yet. So I do want to get to this before we end, because I did mention this a couple times, and then we'll definitely come back to Daniela's example and these questions of different parenting styles being matched. So context is definitely important. So it does appear that for Black American families, authoritarian parenting actually does seem to be more positive, doesn't seem to have as many risk factors or be as much of a risk factor. It might in some ways be a protective factor. So is that because of the context that they're in? It's not super clear exactly why that is. Also, the culture of the Arab world is very patriarchal and authoritarian. So there are still positives, children developing and thriving positively even with a more authoritarian parents. And also Asian American parents tend to show some signs that we would call authoritarian and some things that we would call authoritative. So still a lot of warmth, but maybe even higher and stricter demands than you might see from general authoritative from, let's say, white middle-class Americans. So this has inspired some researchers to say that, well, maybe we should break up these parenting styles, and rather than having these main categories, maybe we should add more categories, more spectrums, and more dimensions to these, which is one way researchers have taken since then to say that rather than saying Asian American parents tend to be both authoritarian and authoritative, saying, well, and then the other idea is, well, maybe we should just describe the kinds of parenting techniques that they use rather than having these boxes of categories of parenting styles. So I'm definitely a little more on the side of, rather than having these little boxes of parenting styles to try and fit people in, we can talk about the types of parenting skills or techniques that are positive or beneficial versus not. So being really responsive and warm is a really good example of that is something that is positive and a protective factor, but also having clearly stated demands that have discussion. That's another example of a skill that you might use. So this is where we're at right now with the research, and that's kind of one of the discussions, because we don't see that everyone falls into these things, and especially as we study more cross-culturally and multi-ethnically, we see that the preconceived notions that we had when we were only studying white middle-class American families doesn't always fit every single group. Surprise, surprise, right? So we're definitely going to come back to parenting styles. I'm glad for all the questions. Are there other questions right now? I was feeling my phone buzz, which is oftentimes a comment, but maybe it was just emails. All right, so we're a little bit over on time. Next time we come back, we'll do a quick review of these parenting styles. So it's back in our minds again, and then I'll show you a couple of video clips, and in small groups, you'll decide which kind of parenting style it was. All right, well, thank you very much for the input and questions at the end here. Sorry it was all so short at the end, but have a great rest of your day. Hopefully we'll continue this discussion next time.